Hey, this is Dr. Eric, and this is a bonus episode where Salena Rothenberger gives an amazing presentation entitled A Nutrigenomic Approach to Hair Loss. This was presented on Facebook Live, and then Salena, Julie Olson, and myself answered some questions related to hair loss, which you can listen to on a separate Q&A episode that was released the same time as this episode. So if you just want to listen to this episode, that's fine. But if you want to hear some of the questions other people with hyperthyroidism and Hashimoto's had about hair loss, you can check out the separate Q&A episode. And with that being said, let's go ahead and get started.
Welcome to the Save My Thyroid podcast, hosted by Dr. Eric Osansky. To stay up to date on the latest thyroid health-related topics, visit SaveMyThyroid.com. The following discussion is for educational purposes only and is not intended to diagnose or treat any disease. Please do not apply any of this information without first speaking with your doctor. Now let's head to the show.
And with me, I have two special guests. I have Julie Olson and Salena Rothenberger. I've actually interviewed Julie already, but I'm going to give another brief intro here. So Julie is a triple certified evidence-based nutrition expert, and she specializes in female hair loss, gut health, and gluten issues. With more than 10 years experience, collaboration with functional and integrative practitioners, along with her training in functional medicine, Julie has transformed over 700 women's health and hair. And then we also have Salena. So Salena is a certified functional medicine practitioner, certified health coach, and obtained certification in nutrigenomics through Nutrigenomic Research Institute. She has studied an additional 300 plus hours in functional immunology, autoimmunity clinical strategies, and other functional and herbal medicine related training. She is the founder of the Functional Perspective, where she teaches individuals how to connect their genomics with their health to create a strategy for a clear path to restored wellness. And her mission is to redefine healthcare by providing others clarity, action steps, resources, and empowerment. Thank you for joining me, Julie and Salena.
Thank you. Thank you. It's great to be here.
Yeah, it's a pleasure chatting with both of you about hair loss. And Salena is going to be the one really giving the presentation on a nutrigenomic approach to hair loss. So without further ado, Salena, I'm going to let you take over here.
Okay, fantastic. So like Eric said, this is a nutrigenomic approach to hair loss. There's a lot of ways to look at hair loss, but what we're going to talk about today is the genetic side and what does nutrigenomics have to do with that. So overall, we're going to discuss some of the underlying causes of female hair loss, the role that our genetic DNA and the SNPs especially play in that, and the nutrigenomics side of that. So genetics and nutrigenomics is different. We're going to talk a little bit about that, and then how we can be more proactive and preventative in a nutrigenomic approach to hair loss. So just real quick, Eric already kind of, talked about who I am, so I'm not going to really go over that again, but my mission is that redefining healthcare. And so that's kind of what we're doing today. Why I am passionate about this is my son was diagnosed with autoimmunity in 2014, and that set me on a journey to understand why. And then that has spilled over into so many things, especially the genes side of things, is understanding what influenced him to get autoimmunity. And then it's branched out into many of the things like working with Julie and women that have hair loss. The honest truth is about hair loss, over 50% of women are affected by hair loss by age 50. The management of this is very challenging, frustrating. Most are just going to be relegated to lifelong pharmaceuticals or things that never do give them full restoration of their hair, are very expensive, and they come with drastic side effects. So that begs the question as to what are we missing? What else can we be doing differently? Is there a natural way that we can approach this? So looking at the root causes of hair loss, it really opens up into so many different things. And so what Julie, I think, spoke about before with Dr. Eric was about these many different things of the underlying causes like chronic inflammation, detoxification issues, nutrient deficiencies, gut imbalances, candida, fungal overgrowth, poor circulation, pathogens, autoimmunity, bacterial infections. The list goes on and on as to what are all of these underlying issues. So what is that common denominator? That common denominator comes down to inflammation and how our body resolves inflammation, or where does inflammation come from? And that's where genomics comes into play, because that inflammation is part of our metabolic processes. That's where those genes that are going to, fuel those systems and increase the inflammation in that response to restore balance. So just a quick kind of overview of the metabolic pathways are just really magnificent. I mean, if you look at them on a chart, they're just like, it's just a chart of you can't really discern it unless you really zoom in. So we're just going to kind of pull back and not really get into all these genetics so we could talk for days on them. The 4 key areas, especially when we're looking at hair loss, are things surrounding the digestive system, fatty acid and nutrient metabolism, the immune response, and the body's ability to resolve the inflammation response. Those 4 key areas touch and play a role on pretty much every single underlying cause of women's hair loss or even male hair loss. So many want to know, what is a SNP? Fortunately, with the MTHFR craze, a lot more people are familiar with a genetic SNP, but just for a review, for those who are not, a genetic SNP is a polymorphism, so a single nucleotide polymorphism. We get 2 genetic variants from each parent. And so we can have a wild type, we can have a normal, or a heterozygous. So with that, we're going to get either a wild type, which is our normal gene, a heterozygous is 1 variation, or we're going to have a homozygous, which is 2 variations. So they don't necessarily always mean that we have a variant is a bad thing. It just sometimes can mean that there's a problem. So it comes with my favorite illustration with Dr. Tara Scott. If any of you know her, hormone guru, I think Dr. Eric interviewed her some time back. She has a great illustration with understanding the genes and how these polymorphisms can play a role. So if you were going to a doctor and you thought you were going to see Dr. Joy Scott, but in comes Dr. J. Scott, that one single letter was switched, and now you have a male doctor. So you might be like, oh, I was expecting a woman, but they both have the same function. They have the same training. They can still help you. So that really doesn't make much of a difference. It does have a little bit of a change of the meaning, but it doesn't change the function. But if you take cat and cut and you change that middle vowel, those are very, very different. And so those do have a big impact on how these genes function. And so there's other types of genes. There's 2 kind of main types of genes. We have our metabolic genes, and then we also have our characteristic genes. The characteristic ones are sort of like, where we're from, what color is our hair, our eyes, those kinds of things. We don't really able to influence those. Those kind of genes, we're not going to be talking about those genes. There are a lot of genes that are considered the disease genes. And that disease genes, there's a big gray area in that as well, because as we learn more and more about genetics, it's really at these metabolic genes and the genes that we can influence through epigenetics that we can change the course of our health for the good or for the bad. So again, just to recap that, we have the heterozygous, the homozygous, and the wild type of our genes, and one comes from each parent. And so when the epigenetics come into play with that, it's about the context. So we could have perfectly fine genes, but if we're in a bad scenario, we still will put a lot of stress on those genes and those pathways. And the same when if we have a predisposed disposition, if we have that homozygous, and most times that's a decrease in function, not always, some of them are upregulated. And we're going to actually talk about some of those exceptions where that upregulation, which is regarding to inflammation specifically. But if we have, for instance, a genetic SNP, and it's like taking your 4-lane highway, which is your perfect little highway, down to a 1-lane highway, well, that's going to kind of slow down traffic. But having that 4-lane highway in the context, if you're in LA traffic in the middle of rush hour, you're still going to be at a standstill, where that 1-lane highway in the middle of West Texas, you'll be going crazy fast. So it's also about context. That's what epigenetics is. And that's what we're going to really talk about today is the epigenetic factors. How can we influence our metabolism genes and these other genes that play a role in leading to those causes of hair loss? So again, the 4 issues we're going to talk about, the first ones is the digestive health genes. So the things like the FUT2s, your IL-21, IL-13, these are the interleukin genes. They play a big role in the immune response, but also in digestion. The IL-21 family, you hear a lot about the gluten. The HLA family, also, there's a bunch of those with gluten related. There's some other HLAs that are not specifically gluten related, but are specifically to hair loss, especially women's hair loss. HNMT gene, which is a histamine-related gene, that also plays a big role in your digestive health, which can lead to chronic hair loss when your digestive system's not working well. So many things can fall apart, and hair loss is one of those things that happen. ABP1, which is most commonly known as DAO, diamine oxidase, that helps to degrade histamine in your GI tract. That one gets very compromised with excess inflammation. So if you have a genetic polymorphism, a SNP in that ABP1 gene and you don't make enough DAO to begin with, you add a lot of histamine, you add a lot of inflammation, you have parasites, gut dysbiosis. Now that gene that wasn't even working very well, you have that one lane highway in the middle of that East LA traffic. So it's really not a good situation. MAO-A and B, those also are related to histamine as well as our neurotransmitter health. And that's where we see a lot of times with women's health, there's this overlap between neurohealth and other symptoms like hair loss or PMS or any sort of your cycle issues, your female hormone issues. There's a huge connection between those. The other section that's a really crucial section is your fatty acid metabolism and your nutrient metabolism. And again, this goes to that digestive health is where we get those nutrients, but if we can't actually metabolize them and process them, things still can fall apart. Fatty acids are super, super important because anytime we have inflammation, we need that fat to repair. And our cells are made up of the fatty acids. That structure on the outside to keep those membranes are dependent on healthy fats. So if we can't process, digest, and utilize fats, everything can fall apart, especially with our hair, especially with women's hormones, so many things. I would basically say that about everything, especially with everything. So the PMT gene is a big one for women because that one is actually stimulated also by estrogen. So we see a lot of times women that have the PMT SNPs, this takes phosphatidylethylmolamine, converts it into phosphatidylcholine, but estrogen can promote that SNP and kind of accentuate that SNP. And so when you no longer have the estrogen, as you get to that menopause, we see a lot of symptoms that will creep up. And all of a sudden, we're like, what happened? I was fine, went into menopause, no more estrogen, and now there's a mess. Almost always we're finding, at least the ones that I work with a lot of hormones issues, there are some PMT SNPs there. So that's a really, really big one for women's health. PANK1, your fads, fatty acid desaturates, these are all going to be with your omega-3s, your omega-6s, and sometimes it's the omega-6 issue, and it's actually not having enough omega-6s or the right omega-6s. There's a part of the omega-6 pathway that's actually very anti-inflammatory. Unfortunately, we have fried foods and a lot of, not so good foods that create a lot of oxidative fats. And so, but with women, if you have the PMT SNPs, some of these fad SNPs, that just puts you at a really big risk for not having healthy fats. That's also going to translate into your hair and all of your skin, and all of your cells in your body are just going to be compromised because you don't have healthy fat metabolism. There's several others here, carnitine, SLC22A5, your CYPs, you see a lot of those with your estrogen. BTD is your biotin. Biotin in hair health is very, very well known and established. When you have biotin SNPs, that pathway is not working well. And again, puts you at a higher risk for female hair loss. SEP1, VDR, BCMO1, these have to do with selenium, which is really super important for thyroid health. And that's part of that overlap of seeing that with women's hair loss. And you see a lot of times that hair loss with thyroid dysfunction. VDR has to do with your vitamin D. Everyone pretty much today knows how important vitamin D is with all the sickness that's been going around the last couple of years. BCMO1 has to do with vitamin A. Again, this is very important with the immune response. Many of the hair loss issues have to do with autoimmunity. And so if your immune system's not working well and is not supplied well, these genetic SNPs play a huge role when you have that one lane highway, again, in that LA traffic.
Hey, this is Dr. Eric, and if you're looking to do everything you can to save your thyroid gland, in addition to listening to this podcast, there are a few different ways we can help you. First of all, I've written a book on hyperthyroidism called Natural Treatment Solutions for Hyperthyroidism and Graves' Disease, as well as a book called Hashimoto's Triggers, which of course is on Hashimoto's thyroiditis, and you can find both of these on Amazon as well as other websites where books are sold. Second, you could also join my Graves' disease and Hashimoto's healing community by visiting autoimmunethyroidgroup.com. And finally, if you want to get personal help from me, you could visit the website workwithdreric.com. Just to let you know, I only see a limited number of new patients each month, and I do require anyone interested to complete a brief online application before working with me. And now back to the show.
The immune and inflammatory response, these are ones I probably focus a lot on, or the most, the IL-13 and especially the IL-6. The IL-6 plays a huge role in resolving inflammation and In the immune response, there's an inflammation response. Transforming growth factor beta is a big one, something that I always test for with almost every single person that I work with. If that TGF beta is crazy high, sometimes the anti-inflammatories will actually work against you as opposed to for you. So seeing if we have that IL-6 SNP, that one is actually an upregulated SNP in almost every scenario. So if you have that homozygous, instead of being a 1-lane highway, now you have like an 8-lane highway going crazy fast down a mountain. We don't want to be going 80 miles an hour down a mountain. We'll go flying off a cliff. So again, it's about context. If we have this upregulation on that IL-6, that means that we can have a lot more inflammation. Our body is overprotective. It's going to send out a lot more of that inflammatory response in an attempt to help protect you. But now you have to resolve it after it does its job. And that's where you kind of get stuck if you don't now have the fats to kind of repair that it's over too much inflammation. The SALT genes had with your sulfur transferases, these are part of your detoxification pathways, super important. The entire glutathione family, all of those genes play a huge role, especially any that have to do with detoxifying estrogen, like your GST, or recycling glutathione, your GSR. Estrogen and any of your steroid hormones are very well connected with female hair loss. The glutathione family is a huge part of it because you have to detox your estrogen just as you have to detox heavy metals or any other toxin. So if you can't detox your estrogen, you get stuck with a very damaging type form of estrogen, can be very problematic. Your NOS family, which is your nitric oxide, this has to do with your integrity of your cardiovascular system. How well are you supplying the fuel to your blood cell, the blood throughout your body, your bloodstream. So super, super important, that NOS family. If we have SNPs here, again, we are usually at a much higher increased risk for inflammatory issues and not being able to resolve the inflammatory response. HFE has to do with your iron. And again, this one has a big crossover also with thyroid dysfunction because iron is needed for your tyrosine pathway. It's also needed for the inflammatory pathway, but if it's out of balance, it's way too much of a good thing. MTHFR, which many people have probably heard of. And one thing I want to caution about MTHFR is if you have an MTHFR gene, that's takes your folate and it's part of that last step of converting to methylfolate, which is your active form that your body can use. You don't just go out and treat that SNP. We have thousands and thousands and thousands of genes and many more thousands of variants of those. So we cannot just go treat every single polymorphism. We have to look at the context. But MTHFR plays a huge role in the women's hair loss and in many of your chronic diseases because of the step that it's at in methylation. Methylfolate combines with methyl B12, zinc, and homocysteine. They keep folate pathway working, they keep the B12 pathway working, and they keep the methionine, and all of those are the methylation cycle. If any one of those steps is compromised, there's a domino effect that almost always happens. However, it's more than just, okay, go take methylfolate because you need other things such as your B3s or your B1 or other vitamins to keep those pathways. So we push with methylfolate and we don't have enough of our NAD family of enzymes to recycle that folate. Again, we could be stuck creating more problems than we fix. SOD and catalase are in the same family or the same type of genes as your glutathione. So glutathione is your body's master antioxidant. It's 10,000 times more powerful than the antioxidants we eat. The antioxidants we eat are like a 1-to-1 ratio of inflammation. The glutathione is like 10,000 to 1. So we need our body making glutathione to detox us and to resolve inflammation. If everything was perfect in a very perfect world, we would still have inflammation. Just as our vehicles have an exhaust system that has inflammation, our bodies have inflammation. It's part of the energy transform that gives our body energy that we can live and breathe. There's an inflammatory component, but we have to be able to resolve that. Glutathione is one of the big things that does that. SOD and catalase also are part of that. So SOD takes oxide, superoxide, it makes hydrogen peroxide. Catalase will help clear out that hydrogen peroxide. Glutathione also will clear out the hydrogen peroxide. One of the important things to kind of note on this is the hydrogen peroxide is also created with our B12 cycle. So to convert the B12 to methylcobalamin, hydrogen peroxide is also produced. So if we push the methylcobalamin and methylfolate, we're going to create hydrogen peroxide in that process. If we can't clear it out, we're going to have excess hydrogen peroxide. A lot of times you will see people that have the women with gray hair, even men with gray hair, but the early graying hair is often tied to excess hydrogen peroxide. So always I'm looking at the SOD and catalase genes to see where are the SNPs in those. Is someone more predisposed for issues there? These last couple, I'm going to talk about HCY and the NQO1. Those two are not necessarily directly tied to women's hair loss, but they do play a huge role in methylation in the resolving the inflammatory immune response as a whole. Anytime I see genetic SNPs in those two categories, there's always a lot of wrenches in the gears, and things that should happen don't happen. And so there's a lot more guessing that happens, or you tend to be the type of people that you've tried protocol after protocol after protocol, and it seems like you keep spinning your wheels. Usually that HCY, which is a step before homocysteine, there's some SNPs there, or the NQO1. They just, for whatever reason, there's another set is the UGT genes. They seem to just kind of throw some of those curveballs at you. So I'd like to mention those so people can be aware and be on the lookout for those genes. The other ones that I want to kind of touch on are the estrogen metabolism. And these are super important when it comes to women's hair loss because it's almost always some sort of hormonal imbalance as well. So besides the digestive issues, usually the hormones are one of the first things to go. COMT has to do with your estrogen as well as your dopamine. And that's where also we will see the overlap between a lot of neurosymptoms with women surrounding their periods and surrounding their cycles because of that estrogen, and that COMT gene will get slowed down with the polymorphisms there. All the different CYPs, the CYP 19A1 or the 1A1, 1A2, 1B1, all of those play a big role in that metabolism of estrogen. HSD 17B1, the SALT families 1A1, 1E1, 2A1, and there's several in that UGT family that I just mentioned, the 1A1, 1A3, 1A4, 1A8, 1A9, and 2B7. So that whole section has to do with estrogen, and ones that I really strongly encourage people looking at, anyone who's looking into hair loss or anything women's hormone related. So what can we do? What proactive steps can we take? Inflammation should be the top of the list for everyone who has some sort of hair loss symptoms. That inflammation, if we don't resolve that, we can never get back to the steps of our body rebuilding and regrowing hair. We need to be considering genetic testing, especially for those who have tried some things and they're still having very persistent symptoms. With the epigenetic modulation from inflammation and digestive health is very effective. There's lots and lots of studies of how we can influence these genes. Pretty much every pharmaceutical is based on some gene, these metabolic genes, how they will block them or upregulate them. We can also do those things with natural methods. So we really need to take a preventative approach to women's hair loss. And that's pretty much what I have. And if I take any questions or if there's anything you guys want to expand on, I'm happy to delve even deeper.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. That was an awesome presentation. So you mentioned that it's the SEP1 gene that's related to thyroid.
So there's selenium. And so selenium is just with your health for thyroid. Their tyrosine is more closely related to your thyroid, like directly related to the thyroid, but the SEP1 because of the selenium connection to thyroid.
And then you also mentioned, so you test TGF-beta on your patients, and you also mentioned upregulated IL-6. So I assume you also look at CRP as well?
Yes, HSCRP, always the high sensitivity is what I look at. And then the TGF-beta, homocysteine, those are the key inflammatory markers besides like your basic metabolic lipid panels, those sort of things. But always checking that TGF-beta and the HSCRP and homocysteine.
And then you said the MTHFR plays a big role in hair loss. Do you know, is it more of the C, because I have the homozygous C677T, and then, but there's also the 1298. Is it, I'm guessing it's more associated with the C677T?
For the most part, what's interesting that what I have found with people that I work with, they don't fit into that clinical text box of there's one that's supposed to be more associated with your neurotransmitters and the other more with your methylation and inflammation. I am not actually seeing that with people that I work with. So a lot of the studies are showing it, but I just am not, it's not been a correlate with me. It's about half and half. So, but more than likely, yes, but I just haven't seen it with the people that I work with.
Okay, great. And that was interesting also about the SOD catalase gene, the relationship with premature graying of the hair.
Mm-hmm.
So that was interesting. Yeah, just a lot of great information. So thanks again for the presentation. And before we dive into some of the questions from those attending, including the ones that were emailed, Julie, are there any questions that you have?
I mean, if genes alone explained hair loss, then the incident, why is the incidence of hair loss rising all over the world?
Mm-hmm.
And why is one genetically identical twin, going bald and the other does not? And why are people moving to the US from third world countries reporting massive hair loss and they have no genetic or family history of it? And why are 60% of the college students in China now reporting hair loss, whereas hair loss rates were very low before? I mean, 20 years ago, doctors, that's how they would explain hair loss, is that it's your genes and you can't do anything about it. But epigenetics has really changed all that. And that's exactly what Salena was talking about in a very detailed, technical way. So I'm just trying to explain a little more simply, but that was very interesting. And again, with the latest research, epigenetics is really revolutionizing not only hair loss, why it happens, but a lot of other diseases. And it's definitely loading the gun. The genes are loading the gun, but our lifestyle is pulling that trigger.
Yeah, definitely agree with that. I mean, environmental factors are, of course, huge with all different types of condition, not just hair loss, but yeah, you're right. Genetics, that was what this focused on, but yeah, you definitely got to tie in both the environment and the genes. So yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Julie. So I guess, what are the steps you would recommend, a few maybe action steps for those who are experiencing hair loss? Obviously, work with someone would be ideal, but maybe some things on their own. Would you agree? Maybe look into changing their diet, changing their lifestyle, maybe look into doing some of the testing that you mentioned.
So for me, stress is one of the top things, or any sort of toxic burdens. Those things are going to put you in a sympathetic state, which is that stressful fight or flight mode. So you cannot rejuvenate if you are stuck in a sympathetic state. So stress is a big one to address, whether it's emotional stress, work stress, money stress, whatever it happens to be, finding some sort of relief from that and self-care, and then reducing exposures to toxins, whether it's toxin relationships, it's heavy metals. Those are like a foundation to lay no matter what kind of imbalance, whether it's hormone related or gut health related or strictly genetic related. It doesn't matter. You have to first lay that foundation. Eating real foods. There's not a perfect diet. It's eating real healthy foods. So avoiding processed foods, getting enough sleep, like just your basic foundation. If you've done those things and you're not making progress, I cannot stress enough, as what Dr. Erica said, you really need to work with a practitioner, get someone else to help you uncover those clues, be a detective, work with you to find out what is going on, because we have to have that foundation. And if you're not making progress from that, it's going to be a lot deeper issue.
Right. And you can waste a lot of time and money trying different supplements and labs that aren't necessary. A couple of quick little fun hacks. You need circulation getting to your scalp to get the nutrients. So like standing on your hands, standing on your head, do an inversion table. Massaging your scalp is really good every night. Even a silk pillowcase is good for your not only your hair, but your skin on your face, and feels really good. It's just
the silk pillowcase was like a game changer for me whenever Julie told me about that. Oh my goodness. I have to get like all silk sheets and everything now. I'm just like, it makes a huge difference. My kids love them. I got them for my kids too. They're like, oh my goodness, Mom, these are awesome. Totally a silk pillowcase, 100%.
Not polyester. They sell those all over the place, claiming they're like, they say for hair health and skin health, but it's not. You have to look at the tiny print and make sure it's 100% silk. It's a lot more expensive, but it's worth it.
And you got to hand wash them, or there's some you can machine wash, but you got to make sure you wash them separately and with gentle soap and stuff. We did ruin one of ours, but yes, definitely the silk pillowcase. Oh my goodness, it's amazing.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you for that. And yeah, make sure you visit their website to take that quiz as well. And can you say the web address one more time? JulieOlson.net.
Sure. Start there. JulieOlson.net.
I know there's the other ones too. I forgot to say that one more time. Women's
Hair Loss Expert.com.
Okay. womenshairlossexpert.com or JulieOlson.net. Thanks again, Julie, Salena. Appreciate it. Awesome presentation, Salena.
Thank you, Dr. Eric.
Thank you for listening to the Save My Thyroid podcast. If you haven't done so already, make sure you hit subscribe to stay up to date on the latest thyroid health-related topics. And to get your free thyroid and immune health restoration action points checklist, visit SaveMyThyroidChecklist.com. Thanks so much for tuning in.
I was very impressed with Salena's presentation. And towards the end of her presentation, Julie and Salena chatted about silk pillowcases and how they can help with hair loss. Now, I can't say that I've recommended silk pillowcases to my patients who have experienced hair loss, and my guess is that for most people this won't be a magic solution for one's hair loss issues. But both Julie and Salena raved so much about it during the episode, and I suppose it doesn't hurt to give it a try. Maybe I'll ask for a silk pillowcase for Father's Day.